Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first podcast on voting barriers in America. We are Save the Polls, a nonpartisan campaign accepted into the Carnegie Young Leaders Fellowship this past summer, and we are committed to ensuring every eligible voter in Virginia has the information and access they need to cast their ballot. Our mission is to bring awareness to election requirements and potential barriers that may confuse or discourage voters. Through public events, informative website, and a strong social media presence, and legislation, Save the Polls will work to make sure that every Virginian understands their rights and can exercise their vote with confidence. I'm Sadie, and we're going to be talking about something that might surprise you. Even though we live in a democracy where everyone is supposed to have the right to vote, millions of Americans face serious obstacles when they try to cast their ballots.
And I'm Elise. Today we're focusing on two major barriers, language access and physical accessibility. Think about it. What if you couldn't understand the ballot because it wasn't in your language? Or what if you physically couldn't enter the polling place because there was no ramp for your wheelchair?
These aren't hypothetical problems. They're real issues affecting millions of voters right now. We've done our research, and honestly, some of what we've found was pretty shocking. So, let's dive in.
So let's start with language access. About 8.4% of people in the United States speak English less than very well, according to the Census Bureau. That's millions of eligible voters who might struggle to understand election materials.
And here's what makes this really complicated. Voting isn't just about reading simple sentences. You're making decisions about complicated ballot measures, comparing candidates with different policy positions, understanding amendments to state constitutions. This is a dense, technical language, even for native English speakers.
Yeah, exactly. There's a huge difference between everyday conversation and understanding a ballot. Courts provide translators, hospitals provide translators, even the DMV provides language assistance. But when it comes to the voting booth, where people are making some of the most important civic decisions, language barriers can prevent full participation.
Okay, so there is a federal law, but that's supposed to help with this. It's called Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, and it was passed in 1975.
Right. Section 203 requires certain jurisdictions to provide election materials in multiple languages. As of December 2021, 331 voting areas in 30 states are required to provide language assistance to more than 24 million voters with limited English proficiency.
But here's the catch, and this is important. Section 203 only covers specific language groups: Spanish speakers, Asian Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Americans. That's it.
So if you're an Arabic speaker or you speak Haitian Creole or dozens of other languages, you're not covered by this federal requirement. Even if you're a U.S. citizen who has every right to vote, you might not get election materials in your language.
Let me give you a real example. There's a voter named Shamaya Mohammed from Dearborn, Michigan. She grew up in Yemen and has been taking English classes. In 2020, she wanted to vote in the presidential election. But because Arabic isn't covered under Section 203, she didn't have translated materials.
So what did she do? She had to ask a neighbor and a cousin to help her. And she said something really important. Some of the people, quote, some of the people, they don't have someone at home to translate, end quote. Think about what that means for your privacy and independence as a voter.
This is a fundamental problem. When you need to bring someone into the voting booth with you to translate, you're giving up your secret ballot. That person knows how you voted. And research from our sources shows that this is often why people don't vote at all. They feel the process is too inconvenient for what it's worth, or they believe their vote doesn't count.
So some places are trying to do better. For example, Los Angeles County provides election materials in 18 different languages. They have bilingual poll workers, translated sample ballots, and even audio ballots in multiple languages.
But that's voluntary, and they're going beyond what federal law requires. Most jurisdictions only do the bare minimum, and even in places that are required to provide translations, there can be problems with the quality of the translations, or not enough bilingual poll workers on election day.
And here's another issue. When people who weren't previously impacted by elections suddenly are, like if they're at risk of losing their jobs or facing deportation, that can actually motivate them to vote. But if the language barriers are too high, they can't participate even if they desperately wanted to.
Before we move on, let's check your listening skills. What specific language group is not covered in Section 203? A. Asian Americans. B. Spanish speakers. C. Native Americans. D. Arabic speakers.
Give you a second.
Yeah, think about it.
And so, for those who picked D or Arabic speakers, you're correct.
Yay! Okay, let's switch gears and talk about physical accessibility. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, was passed in 1990. That's 35 years ago. It requires that polling places be accessible to people with disabilities.
You'd think after 35 years this would be a solved problem, right? But here's what we found. It's really not.
Let me share some numbers that honestly shocked us. In Harris County, Texas, that's the third most populous county in the entire country, home to Houston, an analysis found that of 701 voting locations, only 2 were fully compliant with the ADA.
Wait, 2 out of 701?
2! And it gets worse. 300 of those 701 sites couldn't even be made accessible through temporary modifications. They would need permanent architectural changes.
And this isn't just a Texas problem. In Detroit and 14 surrounding suburbs, 84% of voting locations were found to have barriers or impediments for voters with disabilities. Only 16% were fully accessible.
Okay, really quickly, we're going to check if you were paying attention. How many years ago was the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, passed?
A, 30 years ago, B, 40 years ago, C, 35 years ago, or D, 20 years ago. For those who picked 35 years, you're correct. Now moving on to the barriers that are still faced despite the ADA Act in place.
So, what are we talking about when we say barriers? These are things like steep ramps or no ramps at all, narrow doorways that wheelchairs can't fit through, gaps in walkways, voting booths that are too high for someone in a wheelchair, no accessible parking, missing curb cuts, unclear signage for people with vision impairments.
And here's something really important. These barriers don't just affect people who use wheelchairs. They affect elderly voters, pregnant voters, parents with strollers, people recovering from surgery, basically anyone with mobility challenges.
Now, you might be thinking, well, can't people with disabilities just vote by mail? And that's a great question, but it turns out vote by mail has its own accessibility problems.
Right. There's actually a lawsuit happening right now in Harris County, filed in February 2026, just a few weeks ago. It's brought by voters who are blind and the National Federation of the Blind of Texas.
The issue is this: Harris County only provides paper mail-in ballots. If you're blind or have a print disability, meaning you can't read or handle printed materials, you can't independently fill out that ballot.
One of the plaintiffs, Norma Crosby, who's the president of the National Federation of the Blind of Texas, says something really powerful. Quote, voting is a fundamental right essential to full and equal participation in American society, and that right necessarily includes the ability to cast a ballot privately and independently, end quote.
And here's the kicker. Harris County already provides electronic ballots to military voters, overseas voters, and even astronauts in space. Literally, people on the International Space Station can vote electronically, but blind voters at home can't.
Transportation is another huge issue. According to our research, young people who try to register often need their social security number, but many don't know it or don't have their card with them.
And for unhoused people or transient populations, there's often no transportation to get to polling places, even if they're registered. When you're focused on finding a place to sleep and food to eat, getting to a polling location can be nearly impossible.
So we've talked about existing barriers, but there's also new legislation that could create additional barriers. It's called the SAVE Act. That stands for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act.
The SAVE Act passed the House in February 2026. It requires all voters to provide documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. That means you need to show a passport, birth certificate, or certain other documents.
Now, proponents say that this is about election security, but voting rights organizations say it would create massive new barriers. Here's why.
First, more than 21 million eligible American voters don't have easy access to these documents. Your driver's license? doesn't count. It doesn't indicate citizenship. You need a passport or birth certificate.
And here's who's most likely to be affected. Women who change their names after marriage, your birth certificate won't match your current ID. Young people who might not have gotten a passport yet. Elderly voters who were born before hospitals issued standardized birth certificates. Low income Americans, because only 1 in 5 people making under $50,000 have a valid passport. And military members who move frequently and would need to provide documentation every time they re register. Additionally, disaster survivors who lost their documents would also be affected.
The SAVE Act would also make it much harder to register online or by mail. You'd have to deliver your proof of citizenship documents in person to an election office. That completely eliminates the convenience of mail registration.
And remember Senator Pekarsky and Shamli House from our research? They pointed out that these kinds of requirements especially impact people who are already facing discrimination. People losing jobs or facing deportation who want to make their voices heard but can't jump through all these extra hoops.
So, let's wrap this up. Why does this all matter?
Well, here's the thing. Democracy only works when everyone can participate. When millions of eligible voters face language barriers, when polling places aren't physically accessible, when new laws make it harder to register, that undermines the entire system.
Think about what Delegate Siebold pointed out in our research. When people aren't being told to vote, when they don't know what to do at the polls, they don't like voting. And that's exactly what these barriers create: confusion, frustration, and ultimately, people giving up.
Organizations like the ACLU, the Brennan Center for Justice, and disability rights advocates are fighting to make voting more accessible. Some jurisdictions are doing better, like LA County with its 18 language offerings, or places that use electronic ballot technology for voters with disabilities.
But there's still so much work to do. 35 years after the ADA, most polling places still aren't fully accessible. Nearly 50 years after Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, millions of voters still can't get ballots in their language.
So what can we do about it? Well, first, be aware. Now you know these barriers exist. Second, if you volunteer as a poll worker when you're old enough, you can help make polling places more accessible. Third, support organizations working on these issues. And fourth, when you can vote, pay attention to these issues. They matter.
Because at the end of the day, a democracy where not everyone can participate isn't really a democracy.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope this was really informative.
Let's save democracy.